Tonight's preacher is the Reverend Sara Reynolds. I am so excited for you to hear her speak. Sara is an ordained minister. She is a chaplain at Children's Hospital of Colorado. So she brings a very pastoral presence to her words. I listened to it today and it made me feel very calm. So I'm just so excited for you to hear her take on the story of Joseph. Our scripture tonight is the story of Joseph in very segmented pieces. The story of Joseph is much longer than the scripture tonight, but Sara does a really good job of kind of catching us up on Joseph's story. So our scripture tonight, it's from Genesis 37 and Genesis chapter 50. I'm going to read it from my Kindle just because it kind of jumps all over the place and it's a little hard to follow. So let's start with Genesis 37, verses 3 through 8, 17b through 22, and 26 through 34. Now Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other children, because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard this, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to their father." Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had their long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. This is chapter 50. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Hi everyone, good evening, and welcome to the message portion of the gathering. We have just heard the text from Genesis that is the story of Joseph and his brothers. Now today, Joseph's story, which is intertwined with the story of his family, is actually a lot longer than the excerpts we're going to read. The lectionary points us to the beginning and end of Joseph's story. But I'd like to, even though we just read it, I would like to walk through the story together. So in the very first verses of this passage, we can see that Joseph is clearly the favorite child. The verses even say that Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his other sons, even to the point where Joseph receives special gifts from his father that the other brothers don't receive. As we move through this story, I want to pause right here to point out that at this time and in this culture, it was supposed to be the oldest child who was the favored one in the family. But as we think about family systems and the ways that things are passed down generationally, we need to acknowledge that Joseph was actually one of the youngest. And we see this pattern of the youngest being the favorite throughout Genesis. We see it in the story of Jacob and Esau, in the story of Ishmael and Isaac, and in the story of Cain and Abel. Throughout these first stories of families, the cultural norm is flipped upside down, and this cycle of favoritism is passed down through the generations. Now, the fact that Joseph is loved more than any of the others is not lost on his brothers. They know that he is a favorite, and they're not happy about that. Their resentment about this continues to build and build, and at one point we read that the brothers could not speak a kind word to him. I'm going to pause again. I know that's twice pretty early in the story, but I want to take a moment to reflect on how relatable this situation is to many of us, whether in our families, in our group contexts, at work, in clubs. I'm sure that when we talk about a favorite, there's a person who comes to mind who you'd consider a favorite in your group. They always seem to garner the most praise. They get more when you are the one who feels like you put in effort. And when this happens and we perceive someone to be the favorite, whether that's true or not, resentment begins to build. We begin to keep tally of all the perceived slights against us. And in scenarios like this, what I found to be true, both in my own life and in the families that I work with, we start to look for the things that confirm our opinion of someone. So as that resentment continues to build, and we start to hold on to each little thing, it becomes harder and harder to see the good or the kind things in that person. Eventually, all that we can see are the unfair things, the things that that person does that are so annoying, and the things in places where we feel like we see their failures and no one else seems to see it. All of those good things are overlooked because we've begun to convince ourselves that this person really isn't that special. And that is what we see happening with Joseph's brothers. Joseph has been favored over them time and time again, and the resentment has built and built to the point where they can no longer see the good. They can no longer find any kind things to say about him. Now, to make matters worse, Joseph has this dream and he decides to tell his brothers about it. And in this dream, it's implied that Joseph will one day be in a position of power and all his brothers will bow to him. Now, for a gaggle of brothers who are already struggling with the ways in which they play second fiddle to Joseph every day, hearing about the possibility that this is going to continue on in their life and even outside of their family system starts to feel like too much. Then Joseph is sent to the fields to check on his brothers, and we read that before Joseph even gets there, his brothers had plotted to kill him because they were so fed up, they were ready for Joseph to be out of their lives. As the brothers are plotting, Reuben decides that maybe death isn't the best course of action. I'm not sure if he gets cold feet, or maybe he cares for Joseph a little bit, or I like to imagine that maybe he's seen a way for the favoritism to rub off on him. Like he thinks that maybe if he's the one to swoop in and save Joseph, that favoritism will rub off on him a little bit and he'll get to climb the favored ladder. We're not going to actually dig into that, but whatever his reason is, he convinces the brothers to not outright kill Joseph, but to throw him into a pit instead. And while they're eating lunch, they see traders come by and decide, let's not deal with murder. We are family after all, so let's not kill him. That feels extreme, but we will save him, sell him off into slavery, and then he'll be out of our lives and we won't have to deal with it. They dip his coat in blood and say, even though he's not actually dead, let's convince Dad he's dead so that way he doesn't continue to hang over our heads anymore. Now, here's where we're going to skip a lot of Joseph's story. With the lectionary passage for today, we skip the next 12 chapters of Genesis. And there's a lot of Joseph's story in there and a lot about what happens to him that we're not meant to focus on today. Today's passage has us join back up with Joseph and his brothers after his father Jacob has died. And at this point in the story, he and his brothers have actually reunified a couple of times already. There's been a widespread famine in the region. A couple of different events have brought them together. And our story picks back up after Jacob has died. And with their father gone, the brothers are terrified that Joseph is holding a grudge against them. You know, for the lies, the almost murder, the hatred they had for him as a boy. I think it's pretty right for them to be a little afraid that Joseph would hold on to that. They tell Joseph that their father's last wish is that they might be forgiven by Joseph. And here, I think we see what might be the crux of the whole story. Joseph weeps, assures his brothers that they will be taken care of, and then he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. I've mentioned a couple times that Joseph's story is much longer than what's laid out here, but when we put our focus on these two excerpts of the story, it, to me, becomes pretty clear that today we're focusing on a broken family system. And with this last moment of reunification, there are two themes that stand out pretty starkly to me. The first theme is this idea of forgiveness and what that means. And the second idea is what does it mean when God intends something for good when someone has been bad? So I'm going to start with that first theme, forgiveness, which is huge. And before we explore it further, I want to acknowledge that there are many pastors and churches throughout history who have simplified forgiveness to a point that has been harmful or could be potentially harmful. And I don't want to do that today. Forgiveness does not mean that the bad behavior or harmful behavior that has caused this rift or conflict or trauma should be ignored. Forgiveness should never be used in a way that allows us to ignore the pain of what has happened. And we see that echoed in Joseph's story today. There's several points where Joseph and his brothers come together, and the text tells us that Joseph weeps. There's often very real hurt that happens when forgiveness is needed, and that hurt does not simply go away. It has to be felt, and it has to be expressed. I also want to acknowledge and put out there that forgiveness doesn't have to happen right away. Oftentimes, people need time to work through the pain of what has happened. Forgiveness cannot be forced, and it must come in its own time. And we see that also echoed in today's story. It takes a full 12 chapters that we're skipping, but it takes a full 12 chapters for us to get to this moment of forgiveness between Joseph and his brothers. It's not a task that Joseph takes on when he's in the pit or in the midst of being sold to traders. He doesn't stop and say, yo, bro, I forgive you. It takes time. Time lapses. Joseph has to have time away from the hatred of his brothers. Joseph has to have time to think about whatever meaning he's finding on this new path that his life has taken. And Joseph has time to consider what this means after seeing his brothers again. As I mentioned a little earlier, before this moment that we're reading about, Joseph has seen his brothers several times. This forgiving moment is not found in those earlier encounters. And in fact, in one encounter, he plays games with them a little bit and won't even tell them who he is because they don't recognize him. In these first reunification moments, Joseph isn't ready, and the time isn't right yet for forgiveness. So in looking at this story, we can see pretty clearly what forgiveness is not and what it does not do. Forgiveness does not negate the pain of what happened, and forgiveness cannot be rushed. So if we know what it's not, then what is forgiveness? There's a quote from Buddha that addresses anger and resentment that goes like this. It says, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. Joseph had every right to be angry with his brothers in this moment. He'd been hurt by them. He'd been separated from his family by them. He'd been sold into slavery by them. And if he had chosen in that moment not to forgive them, I think a lot of us would have understood his decision. But if that had been his decision, he would have been holding on to anger and resentment that would or could have kept him trapped in the hurt that his brothers had caused him, giving his brothers more power over his life. By forgiving his brothers, Joseph was choosing a way forward, not ignoring what they had done, but choosing to free himself from being ensnared by their actions any further. There's a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Kushner who wrote a book entitled When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And if you've never heard of this book or never read of it, I highly recommend it. It's a great one. But he talks about forgiveness, and he says this: forgiveness is not a matter of exonerating people who've hurt you. They may not deserve exoneration. Forgiveness means cleansing your soul of bitterness of what might have been, what should have been, and what didn't have to happen. Someone defined forgiveness as giving up all hope of having had a better past. What's past is past, and there's little to be gained by dwelling on it. What Rabbi Kushner is saying is that forgiveness is really about our own internal process. Forgiveness is about the ways that we can set down the heaviness and free ourselves from the power that we have allowed past hurts to continue to have in our lives. And sometimes forgiveness is a process. It's a continual letting go of the resentment, bitterness, hurt, and power over that past actions continue to play in our lives. There are some things that happen that you can't just forgive once. The second theme that we see coming up in this story, and to me it goes hand in hand with this idea of forgiveness that we've talked about, is the idea about what God intends when someone has done something bad. In the story, part of the meaning Joseph has found and what he uses to move through his past hurts is by looking for God's plan in the midst of everything. And we hear that quote, "You intended evil for me, but God intended it for good." And that can be taken a lot of different ways, but I do feel like I hear an echo of this a lot at the hospital. When a child is sick or when a family is going through a major conflict, or when there's nothing else a medical team can do, I frequently hear families, individuals, well-meaning bystanders say things like, well, God is teaching me something through this, or God has a purpose for this, or this is all a part of God's plan. I'm going to stop and I want to be very clear again. I'm going to be very clear here. I do not think that God intends or causes the bad things that happen in our lives. It doesn't matter how many wonderful lessons you learn in the midst of the pain. The God that I serve is not cruel and does not cause harm to his creation just to teach a lesson. When we think about what it is that God intends for creation, so many questions come up. Why did God let this happen? What is the purpose for this? Why would God do this to me? I had a friend in college who used to talk about these questions by saying that they're questions that her heart was asking, but didn't have the words to ask, and so her head would jump in to try and make sense of it. And I think it's such a good description of what happens in these moments. And it's what really links us to that concept of forgiveness. It's natural to try and make sense of what is happening in the midst of crisis, trauma, and pain. It's natural. But no matter how many answers we come up with, and no matter how sound our logic is, we're still left with the pain of what is happening. Our head can't answer a heart question. So that leaves us to circle back around to Joseph's answer. If God does not cause pain in our lives for a purpose, what does Joseph mean by, you intended me evil, but God intended it for good? As I think about it, I think it means that God intends only good things in our lives. Again, like before, this doesn't negate the pain of what's happened or what is happening. But instead, it points us to look for where God is showing up in the midst of the hard. While God did not cause a child to be sick, God does give the family strength and courage to show up every day. God provides doctors to treat their child. God drives us towards relationship with one another to provide connection, love, support. God does not cause us pain, but does provide us a way through it. There's a theologian, and I can't remember which one, who once called humans God's language. And while there's a lot that we could explore about what that means, I think to an extent that's true. God uses the people around us to provide moments of good in really hard situations. Yes, there are things that we learn, and there are opportunities that we're given because of the hard things we have to go through. And I believe that's one of God's gifts to us as a way through the pain. Rabbi Kushner, who we also talked about in the forgiveness part, he also speaks about this really eloquently. For context, Rabbi Kushner, part of his story when he wrote the book that I referenced earlier, he had a 3-year-old son who died. And when he reflects on what that means for him, he says this: I'm a more sensitive person, a more effective pastor, a more sympathetic counselor because of Aaron's life and death than I ever would have been without it. And I would give all of that up in a second if I could have my son back. If I could choose, I would forgo all the spiritual growth and depth which has come my way because of our experiences and be what I was 15 years ago, an average rabbi, an indifferent counselor, helping some people and unable to help others, and the father of a bright, happy boy. But I cannot choose. There are gifts that Rabbi Kushner names that he has received and learned since his son's death, but none of those things outweigh the pain that was and is present for him. God does not cause us pain, but is with us through it and works to use that inevitable pain to create something good. There's a song by a Christian band named Gungor, and it's called Beautiful Things. And I couldn't get it out of my head as I was thinking about these themes and this story and what that might mean for us today. The lyrics go like this: all this pain, I wonder if I'll ever find my way. I wonder if my life could really change it all. All this earth, could all that is lost ever be found? Could a garden come out from this ground at all? You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things out of us. And as I have these lyrics rattling around in my head, mixing with the story of Joseph's reconciliation with his brothers, I think I begin to see a little bit what this ancient story might be calling us to do today. We're currently living in a time of global unrest and trauma. There's an unprecedented pandemic happening in our world, causing anxiety, grief, stress, as all of our normal systems and ways of doing things are overturned. One of the reasons I'm recording this instead of with you in person. There's a more widespread acknowledgement and a bringing light to the systemic racism and trauma that our sisters and brothers of color have known about for a very long time. There's massive division as we head into a contentious and ugly political cycle and election. There are horrific fires happening throughout the country, endangering the lives and homes of many. And these are only the things that are happening on a large scale, nationwide and globally. On top of all of that, each person's also facing their own private battles and struggles. You might be facing grief after losing a loved one or a relationship. You might be facing massive anxiety in the face of everything going on in the world. You might be carrying financial and economic stress. You might be struggling under the weight of your own physical and mental health issues. You might be actively in conflict with a friend or a family member who thinks or believes very differently from you. You might be building up your resentment bank, picking up on every little slight, just like Joseph's brothers. Whatever your struggle is, it is present and it is real. In my mind, our calling from this story today is to acknowledge the heaviness that is ever present and that continues to build for us. Joseph's story shows us that we need to look for those places where we have let the hard things, the pain, and the resentment build up in our lives. Those building blocks are heavy, and it is exhausting and hurtful to carry them around. There are a lot of practices that exist that can help us to wrap our mind around what this looks like. Writing down heavy things and throwing them away or burning them. If you're not an adult, you need adult supervision to burn them. Holding rocks while thinking of the heavy things and then physically setting them down somewhere. Sometimes these practices help us to bring physical sensations to our internal processes, and that can be helpful as we work through whatever it means to let go of the hard things that we carry with us every day. So with that thought in mind, I'd actually really love for us to end our time together with a simple breathing practice. What I'd like for you to do is to find a position or a place where you feel comfortable. And if you're not there already, and if you need to take a moment to pause the video and move around to get to a place where you can sit comfortably and you can feel your muscles relaxing and you can feel your breath in your body, take a moment to pause and find that place. And once you're there, I want you to close your eyes. And I want you to start by taking a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And do that just a couple of times. Breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. Feeling the rise and fall of your breath in your chest and your belly. And as you breathe deeply, I want you to start to focus on what is one heavy thing that you've been carrying with you. Maybe a person comes to mind. Maybe a fraught relationship. Maybe the stress of doing at-home learning. Maybe shaming yourself for the way that you're handling at-home learning. Continue to take deep breaths and bring whatever feels most present to you right now to the forefront. Hold it gently. Examine it, feel the weight of it. Feel where in your muscles you have been clenched as you hold on to this heavy thing day in and day out. And after you've had a chance to look at it and examine it, I want you to take a deep breath in. And as you do, imagine you're breathing in the good that God intends for your life. And as you breathe out, I want you to imagine and visualize setting down that heavy thing on the table in front of you or the floor in front of you. With each in-breath, breathe in the goodness of God. And with each out-breath, lay down what feels heavy. And do that a couple more times. Breathing in, God's good intentions for your life and breathing out those heavy things. And I want you to come back. I'll end our time together by saying that naming and acknowledging each heavy thing that you have, by doing that, we have an opportunity to take it out of our heavy, painful backpack and set it down. We have the opportunity to take a deep breath to try and find a moment of freedom from the things that we carry. This can involve tears, and it will definitely take time. And it will likely be an ongoing process of recognizing what you're carrying each moment, each day, each week. But it's a process we must engage to move forward and to look for the good and the new that God is continually working for and creating in our lives. Amen. Thank you for joining me tonight.